The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left, 1920s to 30s, new left, 1960s to 70s, and post-political left, 1980s to 90s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. So to this end, Platypus is a project for the self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. At present, the Marxist left appears as a historical ruin. The received wisdom of today dictates that past failed attempts at emancipation stand not as moments full of potential yet to be redeemed, but rather as what was, utopianism that was bound to end in tragedy. As critical inheritors of a vanquished tradition, Platypus contends that after the failure of the 1960s New Left and the dismantlement of the welfare state and the destruction of the Soviet Union in the 80s and 90s, the present disorientation of the left means we can hardly claim to know the tasks and goals of social emancipation better than the utopians of the past did. So today we're hosting a conversation on democracy and the left in China. I'll read the panel description and format and introduce the panelists. Recent protests against the zero COVID policy in China carried a demand for liberalism and democracy, most notably with protesters holding up blank papers to protest government restrictions of free speech and press. Many commentators laud it as a rare resurgence of activism since the pro-democracy protests in 1989. So we want to ask, what is democracy? What is the history informing the demands for greater democracy today? What does democracy mean for the left? How does the struggle for democracy in China relate to the world, and vice versa? So we have all panelists are asked to give opening remarks of 8 to 10 minutes, followed by a series of short responses to each other, and then we'll open the floor to questions around the hour mark. So I'll introduce the audience in the order they will be speaking. So from my left to my further down left. So Alex is a socialist Hong Konger organizer. She is a senior at NYU, majoring in history with minors in politics and East Asian studies. Aaron is a member of Platypus. Tiger is currently engaged in cultural studies at New York University. He studied history at Arizona State University and focused on the Chinese Communist Revolution. He has never shied away from being a communist and has always focused on Chinese affairs. He thinks about using communist theory to find an answer to freedom and democracy for today's Chinese society. And last but not least, Roy is a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and a staff writer for the past 4 years for The Militant, a socialist news weekly published in the interest of working people. Roy has been a longtime member of the International Communist Movement. As a member of the Communist League in Australia, the sister party of the SWP, Roy was a trade unionist, including 5 years as a wharfie in the Maritime Union of Australia, as well as in food processing, meat packing, and warehouse work. So with that, I will kick it off and go with Alex.
You told me I was going first. Hey everybody, it's good to meet you, and holy crap, I hate final papers so much. That is why I agreed to do this, so I wouldn't have to be writing words for 2 hours. I wouldn't have to be writing words for 2 hours, but we'll see how this goes. So I am, as the introduction noted, a socialist Hong Konger and an organizer, which I think a lot of people will see as contradictory or in opposition. I believe I'm in a pretty unique position, as in there are quite a certain small number of those of us that can claim the same title. This is not something that is particularly straightforward or has a very sort of straightforward or obvious history to it, but I think that in relation to what we were discussing today with the recent protests of Zero COVID, there is a very important intersection at which Hong Kongers look at the struggles within quote-unquote the China region, which at this point includes Urumqi and Taiwan and Hong Kong and etc. Of course, all of the sovereignty of those areas are very much in political debate. Whether or not they are for legal debate or not, that is still very much part of the larger consciousness that needs to be addressed. And as a Hong Konger student, I'm also in a strange position of noting the fact that the 2019 Hong Kong protests were largely student-based, and it received very much wide support across different channels of society, classes, work, classes, careers, and demographics. And only through that sort of sustained support and pressure across different areas of struggle did its impact hold for almost a year and some more. I think that was a very important point of noting that solidarity that needed to happen across entire societies to create some sort of sustainable movement. And I think that we'll see that even more now. And many people draw this sort of parallel to 1989, where mass protests occurred throughout May and June that were quickly quashed later. But I think that a lot of people, when observing that time period, focus too heavily on the students, and that is an obvious oversight of the role of workers and other people that had to play an important part in preventing preventing even sort of quicker destabilization of the movement. And focusing too much on students, I think, at any given time period, no matter how prominent, no matter how outspoken, no matter how loud or initial in their efforts, will not be beneficial for the sustainability of creating lasting change. And we need to be sure to look at the impact of other workers and people from other demographics that also need to be part of the overwhelming movement. I was not timing myself, but you know. The role of socialists abroad and in diaspora also is something to interrogate. One slogan that we've heard recently within the China protests have been translated into something like, we want real socialism, as opposed to the model that is currently offered by the CCP. And I think that issue is a really important one that needs to be interrogated, because this is a call from quote-unquote inside the house. These are people that were not activated during other horrific incidents across the CCP, but the fact that apartment building fire was the key point that has activated a lot of people because of the very real fear that it could happen to them too, brings the issue into a very specific personal light. And other slogans such as we are Uyghurs, I believe, we are Uyghurs, like we are essentially Uyghurs. That's one of the slogans that we've heard very often also is, comes from a place of not recognizing sort of the Han superiority that has been mixed within the locus of CCP ideology and propaganda for a very long time. And so misrepresents and misunderstands the Uyghur situation, because the Urumqi fire, while horrific, is also an outlier in the sense that that region is a lot more heavily policed and surveilled than other regions throughout, quote-unquote, the China region. And for people who are recently activating and organizing and becoming more politically aware, there is still a long way to go in interrogating the political theory that is in place and applicable to the current situation. Many people have also said that we can look toward sort of the 2019 Hong Kong movement to see what has happened there and what can happen in the future. because since 2019, the police state has, of course, increased its surveillance and other sort of methods to break down resistance throughout occupied regions and similar places. But there's a very important point at which we need to reach across arbitrary borders, reach across arbitrary nationalisms, and solidify solidarity that is international and holistic. So I'm very interested to hear what else will be said today, and hopefully that my experience organizing in the Hong Kong space as well as the socialist space will be of interest. And yeah, we'll just see what happens.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? All right. So I guess I was gonna. There's one part of the prompt that focuses on democracy, so I was going to talk about that a little bit to start. Because democracy is a tricky term since it means lots of different things to different people. With the recent protests going on in China, I wanted to raise a couple different claims that are being made today in the name of democracy. First of all, the CCP claims that it is democratic. The phrase democracy holds a very prominent place among the large red propaganda posters draped across official Chinese buildings, alongside the words freedom and socialism. The CCP claims that it represents the will of the people, that its party cadre are in touch with the masses, that it has direct local elections of leaders at the village level. It claims that its achievements, such as raising living standards and lifting millions out of poverty, has benefited the people and furthered their best interests. Want to go a little bit further back in time, Mao in 1940 proclaimed that he was trying to create a new democratic revolution in China, to create a new democratic republic, a republic under what he called the joint dictatorship of the revolutionary classes in China, which he opposed to Western liberal democracies, which he said were actually dictatorships of the bourgeoisie. Now, of course, there's also the China protest and the longer history of what's been called the Chinese democracy movement. This predates the present protests and even the 1989 Tiananmen protests. For example, in 1976, in Tiananmen, there was a mass protest to commemorate the death of Zhou Enlai that was directed against the ruling Gang of Four. And later, there was a democracy wall movement where Chinese people, including students, supported reformers in the party. And at this time, for example, you had reformers in the party who like Zhao Ziyang, who made suggestions like a separation between the party and the state, enfranchising opposition parties, subordinating the military to the civil constitution, things like that. If we look at the recent protests in China today, many of them revive the memory of this tradition and place themselves in its footsteps. If we look at many of the demands of the current protest, they come from this poster hung by the guy who's been called the bridge man from a pedestrian overpass in Beijing. They included the demand to end the Chinese government's zero COVID policies, but also calls for freedom of speech and an end to government citizenship. In fact, a lot of what it looks like is that the substance of the call for democracy is actually calls for civil liberties. In other words, the call for democracy is a call for liberalism. Alongside that, right, there is, let me see. Unlike other previous protest movements, which took place during serious intra-party disputes, this one actually seems to come after the solidification and centralization of power by Xi Jinping, especially after the last party congress, where Xi stacked the Politburo with his own allies and notoriously escorted out his predecessor, a visibly ailing Hu Jintao in the middle of the session. Some of the final demands of the current protest movement are calls for the quote-unquote dictator Xi Jinping to step down, and an end to such an imperial dictatorial system to be replaced by a pluralist voting system of one man, one vote. And then just to come a little closer to home here in New York, I wanted to raise two claims to democracy that are being raised in America today, or recently. So in the name of standing for democracy, President Biden gave a prominent speech this October before the midterm elections in front of ominous red lighting that reminded some people of Star Wars. For him, democracy means the question of, quote unquote, whether the American system that prizes the individual bends towards justice and depends on the rule of law, whether that system will prevail. Later, he said in that speech, democracy itself is on the ballot this election. In other words, democracy means voting against the Trumpists and Republicans who want to deny the legitimacy of elections and support demagogic candidates for the American government. The next day, on Fox News, Tucker Carlson had a special program on Biden's speech. In that program, Tucker distinguished between two kinds of democracy. One, what he called a communist democracy, which claims to speak for the people, but actually only uses claims of democracy to lend an aura of legitimacy to the oligarchy that's really in control. He contrasted that to real, genuine American democracy, which he said was the kind of democracy under which we all grew up. In that kind of democracy, the government is a servant of the people. Democracy is supposed to represent the people against the elites or any kind of particular narrow interests in the powerful. Democracy for him means civil liberties, freedom of speech, and an end to government censorship, all of which have been promoted by the Democratic Party in recent years, including under the name of protecting democracy, all while the Democratic Party has created deeper ties with illiberal and undemocratic entities such as the CIA and the FBI and the quote-unquote deep state, while also deepening American involvement in foreign wars such as that in the Ukraine. And Tucker kind of ends this by saying, no, democracy itself is not on the ballot, democracy is the ballot. So I just wanted to start with that. Because in general, if you look around the world right now, it does seem like democracy is on the front page. There's a kind of general crisis of democracy and crisis of politics around the world today. I know some people will say that it's very convenient that today, Iran and Russia and China, all these countries that are opposed to the U.S. in some way are experiencing serious political crises. But this is true of the U.S. as well, Western European countries, many countries the world over. And so just in the second half of my presentation or opening remarks, I want to just take a step away from the present and talk a little bit about historical Marxism and the ways some of them thought about democracy. As for a lot of Marxists, democracy is a problem and a symptom of the crisis of capitalism. One of the things that they understood is that really democracy as a central political demand is a phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution. The great bourgeois revolutions in America and France were of course democratic, but not in the way that we understand democracy today. 1789 represents the revolution of the Third Estate, the producing classes of society, against the First and Second Estates, who are presented by the Abbé Sieyès in his famous pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, as social parasites. 60 years later, the revolutions of 1848 are understood to be the culmination of the revolution of 1789, the springtime of nations, the big one, the revolution that will kind of complete this whole historical process. But instead, that actually doesn't happen. The ancient feudal society in Europe is not swept away once and for all. Instead, in every single country in Europe where this revolution arises, this revolution is crushed and defeated, and reaction wins the day. This problem of what changed between 1789 and 1848, and what is different, and what is the character of 1848, is a central problem for Marx and his contemporaries, who are the generation of 1848. This revolution is the central political event of their coming of age. And so, of course, the question of what happens in the interim is the Industrial Revolution, which is a big issue, and I'll talk a little bit about that, because 1789 was supposed to usher in the world's first classless society. And yet instead, with the Industrial Revolution and the proletarianization of the working class society seems to rear its head once more. The workers in 1848 understand themselves as an heir to the Jacobins, and soon they rise up in the June Days uprising against the closing of the national workshops. They are massacred on the streets by the liberals and the kind of French other elements and the reaction in France. But many of them also understand themselves as heirs to the Jacobins. To put it in a slightly schematic way, in 1789, the not yet differentiated bourgeois make the revolution. But in 1848, the bourgeois has split into the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And now, when it seems like the proletariat might come to power, and put what's called the social question on the table, the bourgeoisie have switched from the side of revolution to the side of counter-revolution, to the party of order. For Marx, this means that the mantle of the modern revolutionary tradition has now fallen on the proletariat. But this proletarian revolution will take a different character from the bourgeois revolutions that preceded it. So, I mean, I guess maybe just as a side note, right, we consider bourgeois as a kind of complicated word because of its range of meanings. Because originally bourgeois means town dweller, like the burg in Pittsburgh. It represents the new urban society that's developing in the edges of European feudal society, one that's based on work and exchange, and with it new ideas about freedom, as well as the very concept of society, as opposed to the feudal world surrounding it. In German, Bürger simply means citizen in a modern sense. But anyway, another important point which bears mentioning is looking a little bit closer at the way that the revolution of 1848 is defeated in France. Eventually, there's a contest for president between Cadignan, who is the liberal general who puts down the uprising of the workers in Paris, and on the other hand, Louis Napoleon, nephew of Napoleon, a former Saint Simonian socialist, who runs the name of democracy, wins, when his term limit is over, initiates a coup d'etat, and declares himself emperor. This declaring himself emperor is confirmed in a popular referendum and coheres underneath him a repressive state apparatus, which he uses to shut down political opposition and jail or kill his political opponents. Whereas the earlier liberal vision was a world in which the state could be subordinated to society, now it seems like society is subordinated to the state. This is the phenomenon which Marx called Bonapartism. The capitalist state rises above society in order to manage its discontents and the social crisis of capitalism. The way Engels describes this later on is that this is what happens when the bourgeoisie is no longer capable of leading society and a proletariat unable to rule. Yet, of course, at the same time, we still manage to live under capitalism today, and the democratic discontents of capitalism continue to reemerge. These discontents can be marshaled towards what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat, the political leadership of society as a whole by the proletariat in order to overcome capitalism as a whole, the conquest of state power at a global level to take up the task of overcoming capitalism. Or, on the other hand, these discontents can simply become the popular support for a new configuration of capitalism, a new reworking of the capitalist state, and a new way of managing the crises of capitalism, a kicking of the can down the road, i.e. Bonapartism. One of the lessons that Marx drew also is that the democratic discontents in society can be mobilized against this. For example, the peasants in France supporting Louis Bonaparte en masse, but also proletarians themselves supporting Louis Bonaparte. In other words, the point is that the democratic revolution and the democratic discontents have to be led, have to be taken up. Otherwise, they can only, again, they'll serve as a reconstitution of capitalism, but possibly also a very reactionary one. So as such, the leadership of the democratic revolution and the democratic discontents of society is the very task of proletariat politics. In that
Can you
sense,
wrap up in a minute?
Oh, sorry, okay. In that sense, I'll wrap up. I'll say, although everyone in politics under capitalism will say they represent democracy, the point is not that more democracy equals better, but that democracy itself is a problem and a crisis. And so I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to comment that this can shed some deeper light in the examples I brought up above, the state of capitalism, the way these democratic discontents come up, and kind of wrap us back up to the current protests. With that, I'll end my remarks.
Okay, so hi everyone. So thank you for you to invite me to attend this activity, and I want to say focus on China. So from the 1989, the Tiananmen Square, as the protests in Tiananmen Square until the October this year, in many of years in China, they don't have any large protest in China mainland. So during the 2019 in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong people to fight for the CCP government in Hong Kong, but because of the CCP's propaganda, the many of people in mainland, they don't support the protest in Hong Kong. They say the Hong Kongers should thank you of the CCP government, because CCP government gives Hong Kong everything, but it is wrong. So many of years I'm so disappointed of China, because I know a lot of Chinese teenagers, the student in University of China, so they don't focus on the political. So I always tell a joke in American to my friend. I say in 1989, when American talked to a Chinese, say that China don't have democracy, and the Chinese will say we will have the democracy like American. But today, if American talk to a Chinese don't have the democracy, the Chinese will say, yeah, we don't need democracy. So I always talk this joke to my American friend, but until this year October, everyone is changed, because the zero COVID policy, the most of Chinese be damaged from this policy. The people work on cannot go out. Some of them must be locked down in the home. Like in Shanghai, the CCP government locked down 3 months of the Shanghai people. So so this October, the Sitongjiao Bridge protest happened in Beijing, China, and some propaganda be shown all over the world, like a man who called Peng Yifa. He showed the propaganda, the slogan. They said we need freedom, no lockdown. We need election, no dictatorship. So he in China, his slogan cannot be sure in China. So the many of Chinese in China don't know it, but in America, in a foreigner, the many of Chinese like the young Chinese student, some international student of China, they do a protest and they show the information of the world. So the Instagram and any other social media, so then people know it, and because of this, many people in China know it too, and then because of a big fire in the Wuqi, is a city in Xinjiang. This fire caused a few people died, because when the fire happened, the people, the residents cannot be go out from the building, from the apartment. So they died from China. Like I remember, it's 8 people, and 3 is the children. So they died because of the fire. And then the CCP government just said it because they have not kept the safety from the use when they use the fire. So when they cooking, they have not kept the not safety. So the CCP says they don't have the responsibility for that. After that meeting, the Chinese people is so angry, and many people to stand in the street to protest this thing happened and protest zero COVID policy. And I think it has 3-9 in China. I think it has 3 parts in China. So one of them is student protest in the many universities in China, and students stand up to protest the zero COVID policy in China. And I think because of the student in the university, so some university, they protect the student. They don't make the police to go to enter the university. It keeps the safety of the student. And second is the citizen protest. There is some protest in the Guangzhou, Shanghai, like Chengdu, Chongqing. Many of big cities have protest. The citizen protest. It is I cannot imagine it because like I said, since 1989, don't have any night protest in China. But last year, it have so many night protests in China. It's unbelievable, but it happened. So it gave me a hope for the Chinese future. Yeah, it is the first time I have the hope. So, so the third line is about worker. The Chinese worker in Guangzhou, in Zhengzhou, they stand up against zero COVID policy. But there's have a thing we need to mention, we need to notice, because many of Chinese stand up because they want to against the zero COVID policy, but not rather than CCP. So many of Chinese don't against CCP, they just against zero COVID policy. I think it is a joke, because if you don't want to against CCP, like this policy, maybe any more policy will be sure in China. So unfortunately in China, because I want to talk more about the worker protest. I think unfortunately the many workers stand up to protest is just for the zero COVID policy. So they don't care about political in China. And but it is important because I think the worker protest in China is a success. So they usually want to pay more money and to go home, because of in China the government don't let workers go home, and the worker just knock down on the factory. So you need keep working, although you have coronavirus. You need keep working because they need to keep the running of the factory, but it is wrong. The workers' right don't mention. So the workers protest, they won't go home. They will have the factory, the company should give them money and go home. And then they success. And many of workers go home, but it's just buy food. So no any car to bring it to home. But they have freedom now. They can go home. And after that, last week, China to the end of the zero COVID policy show in China. This is 3 years. Many people died of this policy, and family, the person is stopped. But because of the Chinese government don't have any prohibition of the open policy, like when the end of policy, what happened in China? The government, what should do in China government? But they don't have any plan. They don't have any doctor. The medicine. They don't have enough doctor. They don't have enough hospital for the patients who get coronavirus. So it's just open. So I want to say, because the protests already stopped in China now, some of reason is about police, and some of reason is about the COVID policy is already stopped. But I think the protest, like the memory of in the people will not stop, and many people signed it. Many scientists say the Chinese people would die like 1 billion in China to next year because of coronavirus. And I want to say, if that happen in China, the 1 billion to 2 billion people dies because of coronavirus in China, what the Chinese do. So I don't know, but it is a fact that everyone need to face. So we will see. And I think, like I said, the worker protest is the most powerful in China. There are other protests. So I think whatever the future will, or what we'll see in the future, and I think the worker is the most important power in China and the Chinese future. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Zayu and the Platypus Society at NYU for the invitation to speak. If we put this in perspective in the world and in history, there's hope. There's a lot of hope, and it's precisely for what you just said, that it's the working class that holds the future and the answer to these crises in its hands. I mean, the recent protests by youth and working people in China, including the Apple workers at the giant Foxconn complex, this was an unprecedented show of opposition to the government, and forced a rapid reversal, unprepared on these lockdown measures. Of course, Beijing already has a history of quashing, for now, the opposition protests for democratic rights in Hong Kong that Alex was talking about, imprisoned over 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. Please excuse my pronunciation, it's a little inflected. But what was striking was the way that these nationwide protests brought people together. You know, that we are all Uyghurs, or you know, the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Han, others. You know, a real edge against the central government. The bridge man just went in with his slogans off the bridge, just showed what lies beneath the surface. Really explosive struggles and crises are on the agenda. I mean, if you just look next door in Mongolia, sandwiched between Russia and China, and the eruption of protests there. There's any number of countries around the world where this is happening. The capitalist rulers everywhere see and fear a future of mounting class battles, and this is amid their own state rivalries and conflicts. Xi Jinping himself referred to dangerous storms on the horizon. In the United States and elsewhere, the Socialist Workers' Party believes the low point of working class and labour resistance is behind us. And I think it's, you know, you can see evidence of that around the world. The growing rivalry between Beijing and Washington is a key part of what's happening as well. And this is This is also part of politically drawing in some of the biggest battalions of the international working class. These are two giants that are stirring, that will have enormous historical consequences for the future of humanity. Well, I wanted to also say a little bit about what I covered at the talk at New School, because the Socialist Workers' Party that I'm speaking for has a long history as a working class party. We're not part of the left, which is a term that doesn't have any class content. It really means the left in bourgeois or capitalist politics are aligned with some wing of the capitalist rulers that gets labelled progressive, like the Democratic Party here. But this book, The Turn to Industry, Forging a Proletarian Party, by Jack Barnes, the National Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party, it actually comes out of decades of experience of party building that has enriched the Marxist program. And it begins by saying that the only kind of party, this is worth thinking about deeply, because it's the only kind of party worthy of the name revolutionary in the imperialist epoch today, the final stage of capitalism, is one that not only has a proletarian program that looks to the working class, but also has a working class composition and a course of conduct. Because only such a party can recognise and act on the most revolutionary fact of this epoch, which is the worth of workers and other working people, exploited producers on the land, who produce the wealth of society and are the foundation of all culture. From that stems our great strength when we organise and act independently of the capitalist rulers to advance towards taking political power and to consciously construct a new social order, transforming ourselves, millions of human beings in the process. So the SWP and its predecessors in this country have been following this course for over a century as part of building a world communist movement. This was what was launched by the Bolsheviks under Lenin in leading the workers and peasants to power in Russia in 1917. This was the course of the early Communist International, with young revolutionary parties founded in this country in 1919 and in China 2 years later. In the Russian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution, the two great socialist revolutions of the 20th century, it was only after the seizure of power that the central role of the working class was reflected in trade union organisation and their transformations. But today, the level of industrialisation, the size and weight, the female and multinational composition of the working class are much larger, not only in imperialist countries like the US, but in other big capitalist powers, and first and foremost, obviously, China. And a socialist revolution is inconceivable without such a party. And we explain that Marxists are part of the working class, not outside it. As this elsewhere in this book explains what Marxism is. There's a key to this in the Communist Manifesto, the founding document of the international workers' movement by Marx and Engels. The communists have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole, they wrote. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mould the proletarian movement. As Engels explained, communism is not a doctrine, but a movement, primarily. And he also said that our theory is not a dogma, but a guide to action. When it is theory, it's summarising the rich lessons of struggle of the proletarian movement and scientifically explaining how capitalism works. If we don't understand that, we won't be able to do away with it. Well, the Socialist Workers' Party supports all fights to defend and extend democratic rights. Here in the US, that means defending constitutional freedoms for all, won in class battles over a century and a half. In countries like China, the demand for democratic liberties is at the forefront because it's what workers need to have the space to discuss, to debate, to organise. We need it here in this country. Clearly it's needed in China. You can't think of a country in the world where that's not applicable. The rule of sphere of union power being used to advance working class interests here is palpable now. The Biden administration just led bipartisan forces in Congress to pass a bill to block a strike by the 115,000 freight rail workers and impose a rotten contract on the rail unions. This was backed by the left of the Democrats. But rail workers' debates and protests continue over their worsening safety schedule and other job conditions. Just this week, a trainee US rail worker was killed on the job. I mean, these are workers face life and death questions, and that's why when they come to grips with politics, they take it very seriously. In Canada, a 2-day strike by school workers defied and forced to back down by the Ontario government's strike-breaking attacks. As a party of workers, the SWP participates in loyally building and strengthening the unions as they are today. A fighting union movement will develop over time, laying the basis for a Labor Party, a party independent of the bosses' parties, and the course towards a workers' and farmers' government. In China, fights by workers will spread, link up with peasant battles, and win support from young people attracted to the working class as a force that can revitalise society. Advances in struggles in different countries help and reinforce each other and pose the need for active international solidarity. This prospect of rising class struggle is seen as a deadly danger by the bureaucratic regime in Beijing, administering state-organised capitalism there. I'm not sure how much time I've got.
1 more minute if you want to.
Oh, okay. Once again, I'm running out of time. I'll leave aside, I'll maybe come back to it in the discussion, but the Chinese Communist Party, as I said, started out as a revolutionary party, but then it was, within a few short years, it was corrupted and became a bureaucratic regime over working people. But it was the 1949 Chinese Revolution was a mighty social upheaval carried through by millions of Chinese toilers that drew support across Asia, Africa and Latin America. It had enormous prestige, but it was saddled from the outset with the bureaucratic commanding stratum under Mao that acted to keep the working class out of politics. And there's a whole, maybe afterwards we can come back to this, but the role of Maoism in the second biggest crushing defeat of the international working class, the coup in Indonesia, in which over 1 million people were slaughtered, defenceless because of the Maoist class collaborationism. I want to just say something about Fidel Castro and the Cuban leadership, who were horrified by the destructive course of the Cultural Revolution that arose out of that era, the inter-bureaucratic fight Mao wielded against his opponents. They were horrified by the devastation of culture and education and by the violent factionalism and adventurism that was copied and practiced by pro-Maoist parties everywhere, including in Latin America. There was an opposite class trajectory in the Cuban Revolution, where the rectification campaign in the 1980s, stimulated by revolutionary victories from Grenada and Nicaragua to Angola. This was to correct the course and the bureaucratic errors copied from the Soviet Union by once again advancing the conscious political participation and voluntary labour of Cuban working people. Fidel warned that there would be no witch hunt like the so-called Cultural Revolution. Okay, to just wrap up, I think I'm running out of time. The proletarian internationalist course of Cuba's socialist revolution, led by Fidel, Che Guevara and other Cuban fighters, not only transformed the lives, social conditions and political consciousness of workers and farmers in Cuba, like the Bolshevik revolution before it, it opened a renewal of communist leadership in the Americas and elsewhere, especially in the United States. Our aim here is to do what Fidel and other revolutionary leaders did in leading and uniting workers and peasants to take political power, carry out a socialist revolution, and wield workers' power to extend proletarian internationalist solidarity across the world. I think that's the example we should be thinking of when we're looking at how to deal with the crisis that we face. Thank you.
Can I grab the mic? Thank you all to the panelists for the opening remarks. Now I think we're ready to take questions from the audience. I will ask one first in case nobody... And also, there's a housekeeping item I forgot to mention, because Platypus, we have chapters, at NYU, of course, also at Columbia and New School. So I'll try to pass around a sign-up sheet in case you are interested in getting on the mailing list. And tomorrow we have a panel at the New School to talk about the strikes. And so the panel will be on labor and the left. So I'll maybe someone can start a sign-up sheet and pass around. So I guess Mike, I really wanted the panelists to perhaps revisit 2 questions in the original panel prompt in case someone hasn't had a chance yet. So the first is, I guess, I want to ask, what does democracy mean for the left? Roy earlier said, the SWP is not part of the left, but I think you answered the question of what does democracy mean for the world communist movement? So I guess that's the first question I wanted to ask. And also I wanted to ask, how does democracy in China, or the struggle for democracy in China, mean for the world, and vice versa? So in case anyone wants to take these on. And we'll pass a mic for the audience. Don't everyone go out at once.
Jay, are you posing
You're asking us to answer these questions.
Yeah,
right?
whoever.
All right. There's one more at the end there.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
I guess I'll say, just as a quick thing, my memory's not that great. I can't remember if it's Lenin or Trotsky who says this quote. He says, the battle for democracy must be won. And I think this is something I briefly raised. But again, that's like, democracy is like a symptom of capitalism. Mass democracy is something that only arises after a certain point in history, and this is best exemplified by not only 1848 but the entire movement for socialism afterwards. Of course, democracy itself is also a form of rule, right? And so the point is that also, as hopefully the point would be to overcome democracy and overcome the need for democracy as well. So I just wanted to say those 2 things.
I think there's a question in a bit.
Yeah.
But I think this is a very annoying question to answer because no one has one answer. And also, the understanding of the term democracy in the quote-unquote Western world is very different from quote-unquote democracy in other contexts, other countries, other governments, other histories, other systems of governance that have led to these demands. And I see a lot of actors on the left that denounce the demands for freedom of speech and freedom of press as liberal, but liberal in the sense that we understand it in America as a punitive term, the libs, you know what I mean. And it's very difficult to hear that and comprehend that as a line of argument, because as political lines are drawn in the US, the political lines are drawn differently across the entire world, and understandings of different political systems need to be a lot more nuanced and complex in order to apply these terms, because there's no way you can take an understanding of one political system and sort of copy and paste it onto another. There's absolutely no equivalence. There's nothing that can be directly drawn to sort of copy and paste the understanding of one political system to another. And so when we talk about left and right, sure, there is a global left and there's, a global right, or like reactionary forces are commonly understood to be, some form of the word of like conservative and reactionary. But the left and right, as we understand in the US, is absolutely not the left and right that can be understood in China. And I run into this problem constantly when attempting to discuss Hong Kong, because the lines that are drawn within the Hong Kong protests do not fall along what we see as typically conservative and liberal, or Democrat and Republican, like here in the US. And so it's very frustrating to see demands for freedom of speech and freedom of press be called liberal or denounced as sort of really like unimportant or bourgeois, when that standard doesn't exist in the first place. The standard of freedom of speech and press and assembly and independent unions doesn't exist in the first place. That's why there is a demand for it. And when these are sort of looked down upon by leftists that are abroad, and looking at this from a broader analysis that does not include the nuances of specific systems that exist and the specific history of why it has emerged as such a demand, then it becomes obvious when basic civil liberties are sort of decried as bourgeois or lib, as people would say.
Could I comment on that if no one else says anything?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please respond to David's question before we take any other questions.
Okay, sure. Well, I think that the assault on democratic freedoms is well underway in this country, and it's very important in a country that has had a revolutionary history and has a bourgeois constitution that came out of two bourgeois revolutions, the War of Independence and the Civil War against slavery. The constitutional protections against the state and for freedoms like freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, these are fundamental. I mean, and those who call themselves the left and attack this show that they're standing aside from history. It's the same thing in Hong Kong. I'm glad Alex raised this. It's extremely important. Between 1 and 2 million people in the streets at the peak of these protests demanding those freedoms is something that actually hundreds of millions of workers all over China need, which is why the regime had to crush it. It's an extension of the bourgeois, the march of history, the bourgeois revolutions, the conquering of, when Aaron talked about the 1848 revolutions, when the bourgeoisie went over to the counter-revolution and the working class revolution appeared for the first time. But it's, the fight to expand democratic liberties is fundamental to the forward march of the working class and of conquering socialist revolutions. But you have to see everything in class terms. It's not, it's not Democrat versus Republican. It's not right versus. I mean, none of these things really help you unless you see what's underneath and the class contradictions, the class polarization that is growing and sharpening across the world. That's going to explode. I mean, we can, we get a sense of it in these discussions on this panel. And then why it's so important to have a working class outlook and not be confused by all the trappings of left versus right, or the left that say that these are just bourgeois parliamentarism. That's what they mean by democracy. It's imperialist democracy, and that's the way the imperialist rulers have ruled for so long. But they're actually now they have to step up the attacks on freedoms that we need to defend. That's why the Democrats are using the FBI. They go after their bourgeois opponents like Donald Trump, but that's because they're refurbishing the political police to go after the vanguard of the working class struggles, because they can see what's coming, and we need to see what's coming, and we need to start to prepare and organise for that.
Okay, I want to say something like, so every country, every party, and every different history period have every defense what is democracy and what is the freedom. Like we know the democracy of the communist and the democracy of the criminalism is different, but some like you said, some is fundamental, like the freedom of speech and personal freedom. And I think every whatever you call the communist or capitalism, the democracy is important. It's not to break down everyone in home. It's not to catch anyone who says something. You just put here in the jail. I don't think that is freedom, but in China, it happened. So many people died, and I don't think I have some friends say that some people support the communist freedom, cannot cooperation with some people support the freedom of capitalism, but I don't think so. I think in this situation in China, so we face a strong enemy, is the CCP. So I think that everyone require and hope the democracy and freedom need to cooperation. So we need to fight together and don't focus on whatever you are communist or you are the capitalism. Thank you.
Yes, can I respond?
Go ahead.
Oh, I guess I just wanted to say something really quick because people have been talking about the difference between like different countries and different historical periods, and also, for example, Alex mentioned how left and right are such muddled phrases, especially in their meaning, and especially when it comes to China. For example, how like I talk to Chinese students and older people, and for them, like to be more left often means to be more nationalistic or to like want to sacrifice more for the country, while to be right means, to support basic civil liberties. Like I said, I wanted to just add to that and kind of challenge the sense that there is some kind of absolute difference, and that like part of that actually the left and also some of these issues are just much more international, and these problems are much more universal than some people would think. Because, for example, the 1989 Tiananmen protests, there was this attempt to make, like a statue of liberty that was there. Or that, like the fact that liberal has become a term of abuse is something that's, shared not only by people, quote unquote, leftists in people of that kind of left in China, but also, like American Stalinists and American people who come out of a certain tradition in American politics. And so I think there is this kind of, you read the Chinese students who went to try to support the JSEC workers in southern China a few years ago, and you read their manifesto, and it sounds just exactly like things I've read in America or France, where students are going to the workers in the 70s or 80s. So I just wanted to raise that there are these deep similarities in like the way the left has developed and the kind of history of these things. That's all.
Thank you guys very much. So my question, I just kind of recently went through like the tactics of social democracy, and I felt like it really kind of related a little bit to this conversation we're having about what does democracy look for the left, and then also these kind of other conversations we're having about the differences between democracy or ideology from an international scale. And one of my questions, I guess, is like, there's like, I guess I can see a little bit in this like kind of lack of historical qualitativeness that Alex was trying to bring in that like, because one thing I remember when we were talking about this was when in Platypus, my teachers, when they talk about the way one of these leaders once said, like, it is the battle of democracy, not for democracy. And so how exactly does the left use democracy to point beyond itself? Because in the tactics of social democracy, Engels is specifically discussing how this weapon that the bourgeoisie have used to try to pose like as these counter-revolutionaries, they have learned how to use it as a strategy to, bring up, like, step up as, the socialists, or step up like the game for the proletariat. And so that's when he was talking about democracy in that sense, and I can understand it as a symptom of capitalist politics. But then my main question is like, then how does the left use democracy to point beyond itself? Because then that would be the general international question, because the only way I believe the left can view democracy today is still as that tool to point to overcome itself, which is what I think most of you guys have been trying to point to. And then I also have that like further question between like comparing like when you were talking about China, democracy in China, and then in America, and how you said you hated that question, because I thought that was really interesting because when we discuss these, because I feel like the left has this attitude towards certain, when it comes to like bourgeois issues, or like things, bourgeois freedoms like the freedoms of speech and freedom freedom of assembly, etc., that we have been like stressing now, and that like my question, I guess, is a little, I guess, is kind of challenging it, but like, how does that exactly like? While I recognize they form the foundation of what the left is, because I think that is why, like in Platypus, they try to inculcate us into the cult of Rousseau, so that we understand that, you know, as Marxists or whatever, we are only continuing the task of what bourgeois society is, because that's what the proletariat is taking up. And so even then, those bourgeois freedoms are still as vital to the left as they were to the bourgeoisie. And I feel personally, I guess, that there's some times when the left, I don't think they just dismiss it as they don't see it as vital, but the way it's critiqued comes out sometimes sounds like it dismisses these actual attempts for these freedoms, which I find personally that it makes it harder for people to view the left as an actual like intellectual critique that tries to, you know, improve or just try to open your minds to see beyond the present condition. And so I guess that is like something I want to hear commentary from this panel. Like, what do you guys think about the left and its attitude towards just the fight for bourgeois freedoms that exists everywhere, and that I think almost every political, whether it's left, right, whatever it is, they're always asking for one set of bourgeois rights, and that is what is happening. And how does the left, why do you think that attitude exists? That it always feels the need to dismiss it unless it, I guess, specifically points beyond itself, and even then they are unable to recognize if it does. You know, there's an unclarity there, and it's just confusing as to what exactly do you want to see in a movement, and how exactly do they get through to the movement to prove that, like, to critique it in order for its own self-benefit, or to critique it just to dismiss the issue. I don't know if I made enough sense. Okay.
Don't worry, you did great. I ask myself that question every day. I'm not going to keep talking about the sort of theory aspect. I want to point to specific examples of how that manifests, since we're talking about recent zero COVID protests. One very clear difference I see in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of press. I want to talk about like freedom of independent unions later that has emerged as a demand, just so I don't forget. But for example, recently, I think that within the last 2-ish years, there's been a very significant portion of the internet that has decided that something like, there are always like proposals every so often that says that everyone must use their real names on the internet. Everyone should present a picture of their birth certificate or their social security card to prove their identity before getting on the internet. Or someone should have an extensive verification process in order to access internet at all. And that is a point of view I see very often in Western media, and it becomes such an overarching sort of demand or issue that people believe it applies universally, where sort of like imposters or something like that will make the internet such an issue that you must demand everyone not have any secrecy whatsoever on the internet. And so recently with these protests, what you see online within China itself, outside of China, we have access to sort of channels, things that are not firewalled, social media, etc. But within China itself, if you go on WeChat or QQ or Weibo or anything else, what you'll see is just, as of like 2 weeks ago-ish, when these things were at the height of its, when it was at a height of explosion, what you'll see is just pages of nonsense. These characters mean absolutely nothing when put together, but these pages of nonsense and the volume of it were people's ways of protesting what was happening. Because any keywords were picked up by algorithms, any keywords were erased immediately, any posts, any people that mentioned anything to do with specific keywords around recent incidents had their accounts wiped or blocked or banned. Posts were gone immediately. And so people started typing out nonsense. And then when the nonsense got banned, people started typing out specific messages that were like the character good over and over again, ha. And it was just like a page of ha, 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 ha. And that was a symbol of protest because you couldn't say what you really felt. And therefore, translating that offline, you have people holding up blank sheets of A4 paper, blank white paper. And that is what is termed the A4 revolution, because you can't say what you really feel. But anyone that sees anything like that, the pages of good, or a blank sheet of paper, know what you're talking about, know what you're expressing, and know what you're feeling. But you can't actually say it out loud. On the internet specifically, all of it gets wiped immediately. These algorithms, people that are working overtime, lines of code that have this sort of, also because so much of the internet, the Tencent and the Alibaba control over any sort of social media platform has that kind of oversight. And so there is no freedom of speech in the sense that no ideas can be exchanged. Nothing can reach a higher discourse. And so when you get to that issue, and tying this back to what we brought up earlier with the Sifengqiao, the banners that were hung up by Panelists, as well as the manifesto that came out later, his manifesto was very much in line with what we would call the contemporary Chinese democracy movement, the sort of demands, the sort of structures that it calls for, as well as what it takes issue with. And then you can also contrast that with the Chinese democracy, the remnants of the Chinese democracy movement here abroad in the US called Minyun, which is sort of the old guard from 1989. People that might have fled, people that might have been in exile or whatever, but situated abroad, have very little connection to China. People in China itself have very little connection to people on the ground, and it serves as sort of this relic of what was 1989, and therefore it's very much called out of touch. I would say with people that are protesting now, a lot of young Chinese students or young Chinese people that are protesting now do not identify with any of the Minyun era, do not identify with any of that generation. And I would like to draw that together because there is no space to develop and bring into discourse the ideas of that 89 generation. There was no through line to have them develop through time and transform and evolve into something that is still viable today, or sustainable, or makes sense, or is in line with anybody that is protesting right now. With the manifesto, what a lot of people, with Pang Lifao's manifesto from the Sifengqiao, what a lot of people take issue with nowadays is that feminists, queer activists find that the contemporary Chinese democracy movement often excludes women, is often misogynistic, and very heteronormative, et cetera, because there is no room to develop more of that understanding in a common space. There is absolutely no space to discuss and develop and bring into theory and discussion of other people's experiences and needs and desires and wants and what else they have suffered. And like I brought up earlier with the sort of the slogan that has become very popular, like the we are all Uyghurs, or we are all Tibetans. That has also drawn ire from Uyghur and Tibetan communities because they do not find commonalities with Han superiority that is so entrenched in CCP politics. They do not enjoy the fact that, now that some Han people have felt the sting of the CCP, that now they are bringing in the idea that, oh, wait, now I know what it feels like to be oppressed because they weren't sort of activated before. And so a lot of these people find it insulting, and also erases the fact that the ethnic minorities have been persecuted for so long that is just commonplace to accept the word like Xinjiang, which is new frontier, versus what other, maybe East Turkestan, or even just a city name itself, Urumqi. And there's a large disconnect, I think, between, for example, what you see on the internet because of censorship. There's absolutely nothing you can discern and view and understand other than impassioned rants of the same character over and over again, blank pieces of paper. The remnants of the '89 movement that are abroad and disconnected and not developed and not applicable because a lot of these assholes are very hawkish and MAGA, whatever else, that think that their understanding of the world can still be sustained through Sitongqia as well as protests today, but they really can't. And there's also a lot of fear of lack of trust, fear of security from newer sort of protesters, newer activists, newer organizers, because they see what happened with these '89 Minyun people that didn't develop their political understanding and continued on the same sort of like one-track mind. And there's a fear of engaging with that. There's a fear of thinking that they won't move with them. Fear of building that trust also with like Uyghur and Tibetan and Hong Konger communities. And so the lack of the space to develop these ideas through freedom of speech, press, assembly, and independent unions, etc., is harmful, very harmful in building and sustaining a mass movement. And that's why it's such a potent tool for regimes to use to keep people oppressed.
All right. I'd like to ask the panelists to keep their responses a little shorter, just because I want to make sure we get up there. It's fine. I want to make sure we get a lot of questions. But does anyone else want to respond with some degree of brevity to this question? No. All right. Okay. I'll take the next question.
Struggles for basic freedoms mark working people right around the world, from the description of the fights in China to what is happening in this country. Rail workers voted down a contract twice here and were ordered back to work by the Democratic Party administration of Joseph Biden, backed by his Republican colleagues. Truckers in South Korea waged, thousands of them waged a strike for livable working conditions and better wages. Were ordered back to work by the government there. Workers in Ontario, Canada were also ordered to go back to work, and every one of them fined individually by the Ontario government. Education workers, they refused to accept that order, won solidarity from other working people, and forced the government to back off their anti-labour, anti-democratic laws that prevented them from taking strike action. The fights for democracy mark the struggles of working people in China, Iran, and elsewhere around the world. It seems to me that going into these fights we have a tremendous advantage. The lessons of previous struggles by working people to conquer basic freedoms, defend them, and to use them to advance struggles against all exploitation and oppression. The lessons of those struggles are available. They're captured in the speeches of great revolutionary leaders like Malcolm X in this country, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and others. And we can use those to understand better how to organize the day and the kind of party and movement that we need to build. Just one last thing. I was reminded of this by the joke that Tiger described in his presentation. I think the US ruling class thought the massive growth of the capitalist economy in China would help save capitalist democracy for the world, that it would lift the worldwide capitalist economy up. But what has occurred has been the opposite over the past couple of decades. What it has produced is a deepening class struggle and political polarization in China, deepening national struggles, working people in China much more part of the world, and the possibility for working people finding our common interests and organising together have grown tremendously, which is good for the working class movement.
So that's more like a comment than a question, in case anyone wants to respond. Or we can
Anyone
move
want
on.
to pose a question?
Is the working class movement the left, though?
I think there's a hand back there.
Let me translate that.
Is the working class movement the left?
There's an answer there. I'll turn my opportunity to respond over to the fellow member of the Socialist.
My name's Joanne Kamiansky, and I'm also a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. And, you know, when the speaker, Ron, said that the low point of working class resistance is behind us, that's your answer. In the past year, there have been an increasing number of strikes by workers. I'm a bakery worker in our industry. Most of them are over untenable working hours, no childcare, no family time, speed up, the brutality of speed up all over the world. You know, that's how they boost their profits at our expense. I mean, look at the Foxconn workers at the huge iPhone complex, you know, in China. So the question of freedoms, I think that, is it Alex? I mean, I think you were getting at that. Workers everywhere are fighting for the right to assemble, the right to speak. You know, we need that debate and discussion to develop the competence and leadership to be able to form a revolutionary party, to transform our unions into real fighting instruments, to end this system of exploitation. And that's not the left. You know, the working class movement is workers organizing through our organizations, our unions, and fighting through our unions, you know, building revolutionary parties that are proletarian in composition. And then just one final thing I wanted to say is if you look at the history of the FBI in this country, it was formed under President Roosevelt on the eve of World War II, and the first target was the labor movement. You know, there were thousands of informants in trade unions. Unions were prosecuted for refusing, you know, to stop striking during the war. And then the next target were vanguard workers like the Socialist Workers' Party, who were part of leading struggles of Teamsters in the Midwest, both the Teamsters and our party, and charged with thought control legislation, you know, freedoms, you know, that you could not, the Smith Act in this country was against advocating against the war, against this system of government. And you see the beginnings of that again today, led by the Democrats. And so we have every interest in defending freedom of speech for everyone, freedom of assembly. You know, that's to the advantage of the working class.
Yeah, I guess I can say something about, because also there was an earlier question about the left and the attitude towards bourgeois freedoms. Because I know, like, there is like a kind of phobia on a lot of the left towards this. You know, some people, they don't want to say liberal civil rights, they want to say democratic rights instead, when they mean the same thing. Like, I would say, you know, that like, that in China there are these like very heroic and like these, you know, massive strikes in the past several years. But there's this, you know, there's no ability to have kind of an independent, organized politics in China today because of the, you know, because of the Chinese Communist Party. That if you try to organize on any sort of level, you know, you're picked up and you're sent to prison. And I guess even though that, you know, that the U.S. is still actually, you know, quite illiberal today, you know, there is like this ability for independent political organization and independent, you know. That kind of thing in the U.S. So that's one thing I wanted to raise, and also, you know, that like that also raises the question of internationalism. That like, for example, if the CCP falls tomorrow, like what is, if there's no socialist politics on any organized level internationally, then the result is probably going to be very, very right wing, right? So it's like these things are. I just wanted to, you know, raise that and just say that, you know, these things are very tied together, and there's a larger connection there.
I want to say something like, although the nowadays America has the democracy, is a capitalism democracy in America, but I think by China, even if the capitalism democracy is the ingress of China is better than now, because like you said, what the FBI do before in the 19th century, the big enemy, the important, the FBI want to against the working protest in America. But here is what happened in China, and like Aaron said, in China, even if you want to mobilize some people to stand in street, it is hard because the government, the CCP government, they can say you every chat in your phone, like in any social media. So when they find someone want to have some protest on the street, the police will come to your home and to bring you to the police station, put you to the jail. So the Chinese people don't have the almost them. They don't have any chance to attend the protest. And I think the most of the Chinese, and like I said, they don't focus on the political. They just want to have a good living in China. And but I want to say, the first, I think maybe someone have different opinion different from me, but I want to say I think the capitalism democracy is better, is good to China because it is better than now. But like I said, I am a communist. So why I look forward to the communist? Because even if we have democracy of the capitalism, so the condition of worker is better now. No, I don't think. I think it is better, but the workers should own the factory. So everyone should manage themselves. This is the communist from the Marx. So I think it is good, and it is what we need to fight for. Thank you.
I think we have another question here.
Yeah, I'm just curious, very briefly, like with respect to the topic tonight, and really like more international topics at large, what do you think is the task of the left in the United States, or Marxists, or communists, or however you want to identify yourself? Because I guess, you see the same thing that happens over and over again, which a lot of times with these things is for socialists in the US or leftists to kind of draw battle lines in the sand and pretty much decide who has the correct stance on these international issues without actually trying to make a concrete analysis of the situation and figure out what do I need to do objectively to advance the cause of Marxism and the cause of labor. And I guess with a proviso would be I would like to hear, if possible, like a concrete answer inflected by theory, because obviously, it's easy to say, well, we just need to build a party, or we need to build a militant labor movement. But what we've been doing is clearly not working. So we don't have a Marxist party. The labor movement is strong, but still dominated by economism and things like that. The Marxists have not been able to make really a headway in the labor movement for years. So what you see right now, whatever your definition of a leftist is, whatever your take on Marxist theory is, as a concrete thing to do with respect to the protests in China.
Yeah, I'm not very great with talking in theoretical concepts, so that's perfect. Concretely, I think that as leftists abroad, I categorize myself as a leftist abroad because diaspora, I think, often has a dirty ring to it. Diaspora is often looked down upon by people that are from whatever country of origin and from the country that they currently reside in. It is a very commonly dismissive attitude, I think, toward diaspora, because whether or not they're exiled, whether they left voluntarily or whatever it is, there is a caught in between moment. And so what ends up happening, what is happening at this point is that Chinese international students who are specifically being activated right now or organizing for the first time, attending protests or vigils for the first time, discussing this political change for the first time, there are no structures to welcome them into. There are no structures that help these new activists and organizers along. Even if people just have a passing sort of fancy or interest, what ends up happening is that they only have each other. And so when they want to organize actions for whatever purpose, morale boosting or petitioning for something or appealing for something, or like, for example, there's a letter going around to ask for mental health support for Chinese and Uyghur students abroad. Whenever these actions happen, it is very, very, what's it called? Insular. It's very insular among the Chinese international students. It's often among the same Telegram channels, it's among the same platforms that are already used, and so it is hard to build concrete support and solidarity outside of people that are already in communication with each other. And therefore, for those that are of Chinese, Taiwanese, Hong Kong, Uyghur, Tibetan diaspora, etc., people who have already been organizing abroad need to be able to support and welcome that new energy and bring it into sort of the movement as a whole with resources and support. Because a lot of these organizers organizing for the first time will not understand how to navigate school policy, city policy, will not understand how to deal with police or with whatever else legislative aspects of whatever they want to intend. And so things end up being disorganized, end up being unproductive without a goal or aimless. And so there can be a very, very easy deterioration of support, motivation, energy, etc., etc. And so for people with existing connections to anyone that is interested in starting, that is one aspect that I think would be really important, is focusing on building that grassroots solidarity with people who are outside of any specific sphere, outside of any already existing structure or sphere. And because they often will have to wrestle with the question of what happens when they go back home. What happens to their family? What happens to their house? What happens if they have to go back home for break? And so, basic OPSEC is something that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. Just super simple stuff like what to post publicly or not, what to say publicly or not, is not something that a lot of people understand. And a lot of instincts that are almost second nature to organizers are not obvious at first glance. So that is one concrete thing that I would be suggesting, because rather than emphasize on any sort of hawkish policy interventions that are on some federal national level, what is practical and what is achievable in building grassroots international solidarity is reaching out to the people who are interested in activating, who are interested in organizing and need support and resources and advice, and make sure that we meet them as equals without them being absorbed into sort of the right-wing Fox News, Tucker Carlson whirlpool of reactionary assholes.
Yeah, I guess there's several parts to that question, but maybe I might try to go backwards, because the last part of the question was what can the U.S. left on a concrete level do to support the protests or react with respect to the left in China. And I guess maybe speaking more personally, I don't think there is much that the U.S. left can do, because there is just not really an organizational capacity. There's any organized left in the U.S. that's able to do anything, for not just in China, but for many different kinds of things everywhere in the world. And I think the first step of anything is to actually recognize that and recognize the current, like, what's the word, like, I'm slipping on the words, but the present, inability, the immaturity, the whatever, or, after, this whole kind of 100 years of kind of regression on the left. And, because at the left as is, which a lot of cases really just people, on the internet, people like who are kind of eclectic, people, students who read books, that kind of thing, it ends up being just very reactive, and also ends up just being, stance mongering, where it's about, solidarity or internationalism just means having the correct take or something like that. And of course, the question is like, how could you even support such a take, or what, what does having a take even mean if you can't do anything organizationally or practically or politically about that? And so maybe just on the, and I guess like, there's a slide into just thinking about things in geopolitical terms, or, and like, this might be a slight tangent, but like one historical anecdote I like is that when Trotsky goes to the front lines in World War I to negotiate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, it's like there's these official diplomatic negotiations, but he's going there on his train with like filled with these flyers to give to the German soldiers at the front, right? It's like there's a kind of like what kind of internationalism means, or like British workers like striking to support the Russian civil war and that kind of thing. Like there is a kind of element of internationalism I think is kind of lost today in stance mongering and this kind of thing.
Actually, sorry. The reason why I grabbed it back is because I think that the definition of the U.S. left is also very vague, because I think in that reference of the U.S. left can do nothing is a little bit defeatist and also dismissive of how wide and broad the quote-unquote U.S. left is. What I want to focus on is the fact that a diaspora population can also be counted as part of the U.S. left. There are people who are from specific regions of China or Taiwan or Hong Kong or whatever that would call themselves part of the left and exist in the United States. And I would say that it would be inaccurate to concretely say that the U.S. left is unable to do anything. But also, if we were to specify even further, I think what we really are talking about is a U.S. left that has zero connection to any of these places. We're talking about largely the non-Chinese, non-Hong Kong or non-CCP affected left. And when we get to that point, the internationalism we sort of yearn for in the past, doesn't really exist anymore. And it's up to us to define what it looks like in the modern times, because we cannot rely on a policy or strategy that was founded upon war. Anything that we want, we cannot rely on anything that has to do concretely with the idea of encouraging war internationally, right? Like, there's no hawkish policy anybody on the left would like to promote or support. Because of global militarism and the global police state and how capital flows, et cetera, et cetera. One other thing I want to point out is everyone has talked about the Foxconn workers. The Foxconn workers that were trapped in the closed loop production, was part of speed up processes. And it wasn't just that they were forced to work with long hours. They were physically locked inside buildings, and they physically could not move elsewhere from infected disease dorms and lack of medical and food supplies, basic food and basic supplies for surviving. And Foxconn supplies Apple and Amazon. What do Apple and Amazon here have today? Apple Retail Union and Amazon Labor Union. And not to, the fact that Amazon Labor Union exists at all in any state is an enormous surprise to many people. But the success also cannot be overstated because they cannot be left alone to flounder. What we talk about on the online left, if it's not representative, then we need to be able to show up en masse in support of Amazon Labor Union, Apple Retail Union, these workers that are fighting an unprecedented fight against enormous capitalist megalomaniacs that have nothing stopping them from gaining more control. Drawing that direct line between Amazon Labor Union, Apple Retail Union, and Foxconn workers who had to physically jump over fences to escape from the lockdown conditions is one other thing that global sort of leftism needs to take account for and show up for.
Okay, I'm a little conscious of time here. Sorry for starting a little bit late. So what I'm going to do now is everybody who wants to ask a question, I'm going to round you all up and ask you to get all the questions, and then the panelists can respond to all of them in one go, and that'll be our closing gesture. So put your hand up. Hands up. Cool.
So my question is, so it seems on the one hand, if my memory is right, one of the popular protest slogans in China, an apparently socialist country, right now is "We want real socialism." So you have that on the one hand. On the other hand, the demands of these activists include things like freedom of speech and assembly, that is the sort of bourgeois freedoms that we enjoy in the US, i.e. freedoms that, from our perspective, aren't socialist. So, and I'm going to raise the question that's been repeated again, because I think it's important. What does democracy mean? What does socialism mean? And I'm raising this question not for pure intellectual amusement, but because the protesters and workers in China and the United States are raising these questions. And it seems that these ideas like democracy and socialism, appear differently to e.g. workers in the US and e.g. protesters and workers in China. And isn't that a problem if the goal of the left is to build an international movement?
Well, my question is there's people talk about the left, but it's a very general thing. So, and democracies also, there's a thing called democracy. It's democratic rights are a product of struggle between different social classes. And so let me just put it in a question, which is, what is the role of socialists, of real socialists, of communists, in the fight for democratic and political rights?
Hi, my question is, what are the panelists' attitudes towards some of the professional actors within Western civil society that I think have some more leverage on legal, diplomatic, economic, and geopolitical forces, such as, for example, say the reason why the U.S. version of WeChat today doesn't allow for Chinese censorship is because a lawyer here in the U.S. sued Tencent on constitutional grounds, and for example, say some of the Xinjiang profiles wouldn't have been known to the public unless Vicky Xu, who wrote the think tank piece in Australia, and also some of the leaked evidence shown in the New York Times. I was wondering what are the panelists' attitudes towards these civil society actors, I think in contrast with perhaps more grassroots movements.
So my question is, now that zero COVID policy mostly ended, so what now? What is to be done now? Sorry for the comment.
What?
Which way, or who wants to go first?
Why don't we go with you, right? And move the way.
Yeah, I was going to say, we haven't pretty much in the same.
Okay, well, we're in a funny period where there's gigantic crises building up. There's explosive struggles that erupt, and then like people say, well, the protests in China have been quelled partly because the regime has done a U-turn and removed the clampdowns, the lockdowns. But that's just the precursor to a new gigantic crisis, which has always been there in China, between the lockdowns and the effect that was having on the economy and on the population by a very repressive regime. Forget about the labels that it puts on itself. I mean, this you can't understand anything by what the rate. You know, it's capitalism with Chinese characteristics, if you like. It's a bureaucratic regime that's you look at what happened. A few years ago, there was a strike down in, I forget where it was, in Guangzhou or,
Shanghai.
No, it was where they, where a number of the students who'd been studying Marx and Engels thought, let's put this into practice. What is to be done? Let's go and help these workers organise an independent union. So the regime pulled out everything to smash them, because it's terrified of the working class starting to act in its own interests. So you ask what is to be done, I say keep your eyes on the working class. Forget about all the verbiage about the left. That just confuses people and traps you. Act alongside and as part of workers going into action, learning to fight in our interests, in our unions in the United States, the Foxconn workers, that pitch battles with the cops and they're shouting, fight for your rights. Well, they know the only way to get those rights is if you fight for them. And this is just the tiny tip of what's coming. You have to get a sense of what's brewing, what's developing. And so much of the abstract discussion at universities is just to confuse people and stop people seeing where the real forces that are going to change society, that are going to forge a new future for humanity are going to come from. That's what we have to look at. That's what the Socialist Workers' Party exists for. We want to organise through the unions, which are the main defensive organisations of the working class in this country and in many of the imperialist democracies. So, don't be confused by those terms either. It's workers have conquered a certain amount of democratic freedoms through the struggles, through a century and a half or more in this country. Workers and peasants in China they developed, began to develop Soviets in the revolution in 1925 through that whole period. And the Stalinist bureaucracy in the Soviet Union and the rising Mao leadership wanted to see that diverted. They were terrified of workers acting in their own interests. The whole course of the Maoist bureaucracy has been to prevent workers organising in their own interests. When it came to power, it didn't overturn capitalism until US imperialism launched the Korean War and was going after the Chinese Revolution as well as the Korean Revolution, and then they were forced to expropriate the capitalists. If you want to see an example of the way it's done, we keep saying, look at the Cuban Revolution. It was led by Marxist leaders who every step of the way looked to involve more and more working people, organise in the millions, carry out a socialist revolution, and extend they say, we don't share what we have left over. We share what we have. And they immediately sent doctors to Algeria in the fight against the French colonialism, the workers and farmers government there. Cuba was a poor country, and they're sending doctors and then soldiers to fight against imperialism and colonialism halfway around the world. They did it again in Angola. For 15 years, they helped repel the apartheid regime's invasions of Angola. They sent a third of a million volunteer soldiers there, and Nelson Mandela paid tribute. He said he would not be a free man if it wasn't for the Cuban volunteers in Angola. I know this is sounds like past history to the younger generation, but this history is important, and we're going into a world where changes like this are going to start to happen more. We've been through a whole period when there was grinding economic crisis, a low level of labour struggles, here and there some explosive developments, but now it's when we say that, we don't make any prediction about the pace of developments, but on the other hand, you do have to have a sense of what's brewing. when we say the low point of labour and working class resistance is behind us, we're looking at what's actually happening today. It's not a matter of making predictions, it's what's already happening. And Xi Jinping knows very well what they are facing. He's already facing some thunderstorms, and nothing compared to what's coming. They're frightened. They're trying to batten down the hatches. If the whole thing cracks open, there will be more space for workers to organise, but there will be contention over who's going to lead it. Well, we have to develop an international communist movement that can help lead these struggles and emulate the Cuban Revolution, emulate the Bolsheviks. Tell me what other alternative there is. Tell me what other alternative there is for humanity. There isn't one. That's why the SWP exists. That's why we say, okay, it's hard to see at the moment because there's still not a lot of motion of the working class as a whole, but you get rumblings, you get a sense of it. And we need to be there, we need to be a part of it, we need to deepen that. And that's the way to rekindle working class solidarity, international solidarity. Thank you.
Okay, so some people will give some big questions, and I think nowadays what we should do, so the working class all over the world, they need to unite. So what we need, they need to unite. You know, in China, although there's some, like I say, the working protest happen in China, but the question is, the protest in China, the working is not unite. So every different victory, the worker is not connect, is not unite. So what we should do, we need to do something. Like someone in China and we in America, so we need to unite Chinese workers and any worker all of the world. And I said, I saw a fire is shown in China. It is, we never said before the 1989, but it shows the day. So what happened in China in the future, I don't know. If you ask me, I don't know. But like I said, the end of zero COVID policy will have some damage in China. So maybe a million people will die. So when the people die, when the most people, many of people die, what happened in China? So I don't know, but I can see the fire is heaven. So I think the many of younger students would realize the CCP, they need to push the CCP down. So, and they need to unite the working class in China and all the world. Because, like I said, we can say, we can solve the protest in China. What is the most powerful is the working class protest in China. They don't have anything, and they are most powerful. So, yeah, so please everyone focus on China, focus on the Chinese working class, and focus on what happened in China. So I think the democracy movement in China, they need help. They need focus from all of the world. Thank you.
I guess maybe one thing I wanted to raise is that there's an old distinction in the history of Marxism between trade union consciousness, which is about achieving the sort of gains in wages, better conditions for the working class, and so on, and social democratic consciousness, which is about the ability of workers to change their very conditions and be a subject of history and be able to overcome capitalism. And I guess socialist politics and passive. Would say the point of socialist politics is to be able to use existing democratic discontents in capitalism in order to overcome capitalism. Or there's this problem, right, that the trade union, that just like the union fight, for example, for better wages or better benefits under capitalism is simply reconstitutive of capitalism. It's fighting for better conditions under capitalism. And so the question for socialists is, how do you use these kinds of labor struggles? How do you take these workers' movements, and which are going to erupt, and how do you turn these towards the goal of socialism? How do you turn this towards overcoming capitalism itself? And I guess maybe just a quick note, because capitalism is global. This requires internationalism, which is global as well. And of course, this is why we were talking about China here, but also the importance of an international socialist movement for this. So let's leave it at that.